The steel doors groaned open, and sunlight poured through the slats of the troop transport like a revelation. For weeks, the prisoners had seen nothing but gray water, the Atlantic churning endlessly beneath their feet. When the ship finally touched American soil, silence settled among them. Not the silence of obedience, but the silence of disbelief. These were men who had marched beneath swastikas, who had crossed Europe in tanks and trucks and seen cities burn. Yet now, as they stepped onto the docks of New York, they saw a land untouched by war. No bomb craters, no rubble, no ruins, only cranes, trains, and factories humming with unbroken rhythm. The air smelled different here, sweet, heavy, alive. For the German prisoners of war, the United States was a land they had been taught to despise, a nation described in propaganda as soft, weak, and decadent. But what they saw was power in motion, organized, mechanical, and seemingly limitless. The American war machine was not chaos. It was an orchestra of industry. Every note played in steel and oil. Trucks rumbled down highways that stretched farther than they could imagine. Cities glittered like impossible dreams. Even before the camp gates closed behind them, the myth of American fragility began to crumble. They were loaded into trains, long, rumbling convoys that carried them south and west through endless landscapes. Some stared out the barred windows in awe. Others turned away, their pride stinging like a fresh wound. Mile after mile, the scenery unfolded. Golden fields, small towns with bright storefronts, children waving at the trains. These men, many of whom had believed that the Allies sought only destruction, now saw life continuing untouched and abundant. The contradiction was unbearable. When the train finally slowed, they stepped into the heat of the American interior, Texas, perhaps, or Georgia, or Arizona. Barbed wire glinted in the sun, enclosing rows of barracks that looked more like summer camps than prisons. The guards stood casually, rifles slung across their shoulders, not with malice, but with routine. The German soldiers expected hatred, spittle, humiliation. Instead, they were met with procedure, paperwork, and order. Inside, the camp smelled of pine and dust. The food line offered coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter substitute they had grown used to. Meat, vegetables, white bread. A few men hesitated, suspecting a trick. But it was no trick. The Americans fed their prisoners better than German soldiers had eaten at the front. That night, under the wide American sky, many of them couldn't sleep. They listened to the rustle of wind in the trees, the rhythmic bark of a dog somewhere beyond the wire, the distant hum of trucks on a highway that never seemed to end. For the first time, they realized they were not in the hands of savages. They were in the hands of a people who did not need to prove their superiority. They simply lived it. Days turned into weeks. The Germans were organized, disciplined. They built gardens, fixed fences, repaired machinery. It was in their nature to structure the chaos, but the camp itself ran with a kind of freedom that confused them. There were rules, yes, but also respect. The guards did not shout. Punishment was rare. Sometimes they were even allowed to play soccer, their laughter echoing across the fields. In time, they began to feel human again. One morning, a truck arrived with supplies, and one of the prisoners noticed a label on a crate, "Made in Chicago." That name stayed with him. He imagined a city of steel and wind, alive with noise and invention. The realization struck him. This was a nation that could build endlessly, while Germany struggled to survive beneath bombs. He wondered if this was what true strength looked like. Not domination, but production. As the months passed, the prisoners found themselves working, harvesting crops, repairing roads, building small structures for the war effort. They were paid in canteen coupons, enough to buy tobacco, soap, sometimes even chocolate. Work became a rhythm, and through that rhythm something unexpected took root. Respect. Farmers who oversaw them began to treat them like men, not enemies. They spoke awkwardly, trading words in broken English and halting German. Humanity seeped through the cracks of war. And yet, inside their barracks, the tension of belief still lingered. Some refused to accept the idea that America was real, that its power could exist without brutality. To them, it was all a facade, a trap. They spoke of the Führer's promise, of the Reich's inevitable victory. But outside those walls, others began to see differently. They had come from a land of discipline and fear, where obedience was sacred and questions were dangerous. Here they saw order born from freedom. It terrified them more than any weapon. Letters from home came rarely, and when they did, they spoke of ruins. Cities flattened, families scattered, hunger spreading. The contrast was unbearable. The prisoners stood in a land of plenty while their homeland starved. They began to question what they had fought for. Some felt shame, others a quiet grief. The seasons turned. The snow that dusted the camp fences melted into spring, and with it, the last of their illusions. They watched the American guards, young men not much different from themselves, talk about baseball, politics, home. They argued openly with their officers, joked freely, even laughed at their leaders. In Germany, such behavior would have been unthinkable. But here, it was ordinary life. That realization struck the prisoners with a force greater than any battlefield explosion. Freedom, they began to understand, was not chaos. It was confidence. The confidence of a nation that did not fear its own people. At night, as the stars blazed over the quiet barracks, they whispered among themselves. Some dreamed of escape, not to return to Germany, but to disappear into this vast, forgiving country. Others only stared upward, wondering how a nation so powerful could also be so merciful. They had come to America as soldiers of the Reich, conquerors now conquered. But beneath the shadow of the flag that flew over their camp, something inside them began to shift. The war they had been fighting in their hearts was far from over, but the front lines were moving. By the time summer came again, the prisoners no longer looked at the guards as enemies. They looked at them as proof of another kind of strength, one they could neither hate nor understand. And deep within, for the first time since they had worn the uniform of the eagle, they felt something they had forgotten long ago, the quiet, dangerous stir of doubt. Morning came softly, spilling golden light over the camp like mercy itself. The bugle sounded, but there was no shouting, no forced drill. The rhythm of American order was quieter, subtler. The guards walked their posts with easy calm, hands resting lightly on their rifles. It was not dominance they projected. It was control, and that control did not come from fear. Inside the barracks, the prisoners stirred awake. Some shaved carefully with dull razors, others wrote in notebooks scavenged from the camp library. On every table lay remnants of routine, letters half-written, cups of coffee, the faint smell of tobacco. These were not the sounds of captivity. They were the sounds of men relearning how to live. Work details were called out. Groups formed, boots crunching on the gravel. The camp gates opened and the outside world awaited. Endless fields, warehouses, railway yards. They worked alongside American civilians, men and women who barely looked at them anymore. The war, vast and distant, had grown impersonal. The Germans were no longer enemies here. They were labor. And yet, in that work, pride began to return to their hands. They built fences, repaired trucks, stacked timber beneath the sun. In exchange, they earned coupons, simple slips of paper that could buy small freedoms, cigarettes, candy, a new shirt. To men who had once fought under the banner of conquest, this quiet economy of fairness was a revelation. Some nights they gathered near the fence to talk. The conversations had changed. Once they spoke of returning home as heroes, of a Reich restored to glory. Now their voices carried doubt. They spoke of the scale of American abundance. Machines that never stopped, trains that never slept, cities that swallowed the horizon. How could a nation so young possess such endless energy? Inside the camp, education programs began. American officers, guided by Red Cross policies, allowed access to books, English, mathematics, history. For many, this was the first time they encountered ideas forbidden in the Reich. Democracy, liberty, free speech, concepts that had once sounded like weakness now echoed with strange strength. A few men resisted the change. They still held the old faith, whispering of loyalty and betrayal, forming small groups that saluted in secret when the lights went out. But their number dwindled as the months rolled on. Outside the barracks, they heard laughter, saw the kindness of farmers, the openness of guards who joked about the president, even criticized their own government without fear. To question authority was not treason here. It was a right. One afternoon, a transport truck passed by carrying American soldiers heading to town. The Germans watched from behind the wire. The Americans waved, not mockingly, but with genuine goodwill. It was a small gesture, but it struck deeper than any speech. In Germany, such familiarity would have been unthinkable between ranks. Here, it was casual, effortless. Days fell into a pattern of work and reflection. The prisoners grew stronger, healthier. They began to paint, to carve wood, to play music. The guards encouraged it. On weekends, they played soccer in the open field beyond the fence, and sometimes American teams joined in. A game of feet and laughter replaced the echo of gunfire. When a German player scored and American guards clapped, something invisible broke, the barrier between enemy and human. As autumn came, the evenings cooled. The men gathered around small stoves, sharing bread and memory. They spoke of their families back home, wives, mothers, children in the ruins of Hamburg and Dresden. The letters that reached them were stained with grief. They read of cities gone, of hunger, of silence from the front. It was then that the full weight of contrast struck them. Here they lived under enemy protection, fed and clothed, while their loved ones starved under their own flag. The shame was heavy, but beneath it grew understanding. The enemy had shown mercy. Their own leaders had not. Some of the prisoners volunteered for special projects: farm work in the countryside, logging in remote forests, road repair in towns that barely remembered the war. They saw American life up close: families eating dinner together, shops brimming with goods, newspapers filled with open debate. Every sight contradicted the story they had been told. The Reich had promised strength. America demonstrated it. The Reich demanded obedience. America invited choice. In this quiet reversal, their worldview began to unravel. The guards noticed it too. Discipline in the camps remained strict, but rarely enforced through punishment. Trust grew. Men who once saluted Hitler's portrait now stood at ease beside Americans, discussing harvests, baseball, or the weather. It was in these small, ordinary exchanges that the war inside their minds began to end. By winter, snow fell across the wire. The camp seemed almost peaceful, a strange oasis in a world still burning. Radios crackled with distant reports of Allied advances. Each broadcast sounded like a door closing on their old life. The Reich was shrinking, its cities collapsing. The map they had once believed eternal was dissolving in real time. At night, under the glow of bare bulbs, they read American newspapers provided by the Red Cross. The tone stunned them. Freedom of speech in print. Journalists criticized their own government, questioned military tactics, even doubted victory. In Germany, such writing would have meant imprisonment or death. Here, it was normal. One prisoner, a former teacher, began to write essays in secret, reflections on what he called the prison of the mind. He wrote that the real captivity had not begun with barbed wire, but with belief, that obedience to lies was a deeper confinement than any cell. Word spread among the barracks, and others began to think the same. The camp became a classroom, a silent university of men re-educating themselves through observation, not orders. They studied democracy not through lectures, but through life itself, through fairness, through respect, through the strange American habit of kindness even toward enemies. One night, as snowflakes drifted through the floodlight haze, A group of them stood by the wire, staring beyond it. The landscape stretched empty and endless, untouched by war. The hum of a distant train echoed softly in the night. They realized that beyond those lights no one was watching them with suspicion. No one feared them. They were free in everything but name, and in that freedom they found something they had never known under the banners of their homeland: peace. The transformation was quiet, almost invisible, but irreversible. When spring returned, the camps buzzed with new energy. Men who had arrived broken now worked with pride, not command. They cleaned their quarters, fixed roofs, tended gardens. Some even wrote letters of gratitude to their captors. The irony was immense. The prisoners of war had become students of liberty. And as they watched the American flag ripple gently over the camp yard, they began to wonder, not with resentment, but with awe. What kind of nation could conquer its enemies not with cruelty, but with compassion? They had seen the power of bombs. Now they were witnessing the power of ideals, and that, they realized, was the greater weapon. The sun rose over the camp with quiet authority, gilding the rows of barracks in a soft amber light. By now, the daily routine was familiar, almost comforting. The men no longer counted the days as they once did. Time had softened into rhythm. What had begun as captivity was now something stranger, something that no one could have predicted. A slow education of the spirit. Outside the wire, the landscape shimmered with harvest. Wheat fields rolled toward the horizon, endless and golden. American farmers waved as the trucks of German workers arrived. They were no longer seen as threats, but as hands that helped. In those fields, side by side with their supposed enemies, the prisoners learned lessons that no classroom could teach. They learned that the farmer's wife would bring water without fear, that the children, curious and unafraid, would smile at them, that the locals, though they had lost sons in the same war, could still find room for civility. It puzzled them. How could kindness survive in a world at war? How could forgiveness take root in a land that should have hated them? Every act of decency cut deeper than hostility ever could. It made them question not just the propaganda they'd been fed, but the entire foundation of their belief in superiority. They had called themselves the master race. Yet here they were, being treated more humanely by their enemies than by their own leaders. The work was honest, heavy, often hot, but honest. They repaired roads washed out by rain, harvested corn, chopped wood for the winter. Each evening they were returned to camp, paid in tokens, fed warm meals. They could buy soap, razor blades, writing paper. Some even sent money home through the Red Cross. It was a small dignity, but it mattered. In the barracks, conversation shifted from pride to purpose. They spoke not of war, but of work, of what they would do when they returned home, if there was a home left to return to. The old symbols of power had lost their shine. What impressed them now were the unseen systems that made America run: electricity, industry, fairness, the power of law, not of fear. They began to see that democracy was not anarchy. It was structure with permission. It was order chosen, not enforced. That difference haunted them. At night, under bare bulbs and the low hum of silence, some prisoners taught others English. They practiced phrases from tattered newspapers mimicking the sounds of freedom. Others drew maps, painted, wrote. The camp became a workshop of reflection. A few men even asked for books about American history. They wanted to understand the roots of what they were seeing, this invisible confidence that made even the lowest worker stand tall. One of the guards, a young corporal from Illinois, brought them magazines: Life, Time, the Saturday Evening Post. The images were almost unreal. Families smiling at dinner tables, new cars gleaming in driveways, soldiers returning home to parades. For men who had lived through bombings and hunger, these pictures seemed like fantasy. And yet they knew now. It was real. America was not built on illusion. It was built on abundance, on an idea sustained by the will of free people. Work became not just labor, but revelation. The prisoners realized that the Americans did not supervise them constantly. There were no armed guards breathing down their necks, no punishments for slowing their pace. They were trusted to complete their tasks, and they did. That trust felt heavier than chains. It was responsibility, freely given, and in shouldering it, they rediscovered something long lost: dignity. One day, a prisoner was assigned to work near a small-town school. He heard the laughter of children in the yard, saw teachers guiding them without shouts, without punishment. There was warmth, not fear. It was a simple moment, but it lingered. He thought of the children in Germany, marching in uniforms, shouting slogans they barely understood. He realized that here, education built individuals. Back home, it built obedience. That night, he could not sleep. The difference was not just political, it was moral. Winter came again, crisp and silver. Snow dusted the roofs of the camp. The guards shared coffee with the prisoners, a gesture as natural as breathing. A few men even received permission to decorate their barracks for Christmas. They built small trees from branches, made ornaments from scraps, and sang hymns that echoed softly into the cold night air. On the other side of the fence, the Americans listened in silence. For a moment, enemies shared the same song. The simplicity of that night stayed with them. It was not victory or defeat. It was something greater: coexistence. For men raised on the idea that only the strong deserve respect, this quiet parity was unbearable and beautiful all at once. As months passed, news from Europe darkened. Germany was collapsing. The Führer's promises had turned to ashes. Cities lay in ruin, families scattered. The letters came less often, then stopped altogether. The men no longer asked why. They knew. Their country was gone, their ideology dying in the rubble. And yet, here in captivity, they felt more human than ever. The irony was not lost on them. Some began to write reflections, not confessions, but reckonings. They wrote about power, about blindness, about the danger of certainty. They wrote that real strength was not in conquest, but in compassion. The guards, when they found these writings, said nothing. They understood. Work became a way to heal. Each fence post driven into the earth, each plank of wood repaired, was a small defiance of destruction. They were rebuilding, if not their homeland, then themselves. Occasionally, they saw trains passing near the camp, long lines of American troops heading east toward ports and ships that would carry them home. The prisoners would stand in silence, watching. They no longer saw enemies in those soldiers, only men who had fought for something they now understood. The Americans waved as the trains rolled by, and sometimes the Germans waved back. The distance between conqueror and captive had vanished. When spring came again, the air smelled of new beginnings. The camp gates opened for work crews, and few guards bothered to watch them closely anymore. No one tried to escape. The prisoners knew that beyond those fences was a nation too vast to flee through and too admirable to betray. The war inside them had changed its shape. They no longer dreamed of returning as victors. They dreamed of rebuilding with the lessons they had learned, that a free man is not one who commands, but one who chooses. In that realization lay the beginning of something fragile and profound: redemption. They had arrived as soldiers of a fallen empire. They were becoming witnesses to an idea they had once mocked, and though their uniforms still bore the stains of war, their minds were already crossing a different kind of border, one not drawn by barbed wire but by belief. The days were growing longer now, the air warmer, the edges of the barbed wire shimmering in the afternoon sun. To anyone passing by, the camp looked the same as ever: watchtowers, fences, rows of wooden barracks. But inside, something invisible had changed. The prisoners were no longer men waiting for release. They were men quietly awakening. The transformation had not come suddenly. It had crept upon them like dawn, slow and relentless. It began in moments too small to notice: a guard offering his canteen on a hot day, a farmer trusting them to handle his tools, an American child waving from the roadside without fear. Each gesture chipped away at the armor of hatred they had been taught to wear. They began to see the faces of their captors differently. The guards were not the crude caricatures painted by propaganda. They were ordinary men, flawed, tired, human. Some of them prayed. Some whistled while they worked. Some sent money home to families, just as the prisoners did. It was in those reflections that the Germans saw themselves, and for the first time, they could no longer claim moral distance. The illusion of superiority, that sacred pillar of the Reich, had collapsed. What replaced it was uncomfortable, humbling, and yet strangely liberating. At night, in the barracks heavy with the scent of pine and sweat, they talked in low voices about what they had seen. The conversations had shifted from bitterness to wonder. They spoke of democracy, of its strange resilience. How could a system built on disagreement hold together so strongly? In Germany, unity had been enforced by fear. Here, it was chosen. One of the older prisoners, a former professor, compared it to architecture. A dictatorship was a fortress, solid, intimidating, but brittle. Democracy, he said, was a suspension bridge, flexible, bending in the wind, but never breaking. The others listened in silence. None argued. They knew he was right. The news from Europe was devastating. Cities burned. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years was disintegrating in 1,000 pieces. They heard that Hitler was dead, that Berlin had fallen, that the world they once believed eternal had ended in fire. The guards said nothing. The prisoners said even less. For many, the news was not just defeat. It was a mirror shattering in their hands. In the following weeks, the camp grew quieter. The men moved more slowly, as if mourning something too large to name. Some wept in secret, others stared for hours at the horizon. Their pride was gone, but in its place, something unexpected emerged. Clarity. They saw now that the war had not just destroyed nations. It had destroyed truth. And yet, America had shown them a version of truth rebuilt through compassion. The Americans could have humiliated them, starved them, used them as vengeance for all the suffering Europe had endured. But they did not. They fed them. They worked them. They taught them. They let them read, think, question. It was not forgiveness, but it was something close, a refusal to become what they had fought against. That refusal became the prisoners' greatest teacher. In the evenings, they watched the guards gather around the radio outside the mess hall. The laughter, the music, the easy conversations were unlike anything in Germany's camps or barracks. The Americans were not afraid of freedom. They wielded it as naturally as breathing. One of the younger prisoners, barely 20, wrote in his journal that he had begun to envy them. Not their wealth or their power, but their peace. He wrote that the Americans lived without the need to prove themselves. They built because they could, not because they must, and he wondered if that was what real strength truly meant. Soon after, groups of prisoners were allowed to visit local towns under supervision. They saw post offices, libraries, schools, places untouched by fear. They saw newspapers printed without censorship, pastors preaching without instruction, mayors debating without threat. For men who had lived beneath the suffocating uniformity of totalitarianism, the sheer diversity of thought was intoxicating. They began to dream differently, no longer of victory, but of rebuilding, not with conquest, but with integrity. In the camp workshops, they built furniture, carved statues, painted murals. Their art changed, too. Early sketches had shown soldiers, tanks, eagles. Now they drew landscapes, families, sunsets, images of peace. The guards noticed the shift, but said nothing. The transformation spoke for itself. By late summer, rumors spread that repatriation was coming. They would soon be sent home. The news stirred mixed emotions. For months, the camp had been both prison and refuge. Beyond the wire waited a country they no longer recognized, a home that might not welcome them back. Some dreaded the return more than they had once dreaded captivity. As the day approached, they cleaned their barracks, polished boots, packed meager belongings. The air buzzed with uneasy anticipation. The Americans provided them with papers, small sums of money, and instructions for the journey. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, only handshakes, nods, quiet farewells. Before boarding the trucks, many looked back one last time. The fences shimmered in the sun. The guard towers stood still. For some, tears came unexpectedly. They realized that within those wires they had found something far greater than freedom. They had found understanding. They had come to America as conquerors and were leaving as witnesses. When the engines started, a few guards raised their hands in farewell. The Germans raised theirs in return. No words passed between them. None were needed. The silence was eloquent. As the convoy rolled away, the countryside opened before them, vast, bright, and endless. They watched the American flag waving from the gatehouse until it disappeared behind the dust. For miles afterward, no one spoke. Each man carried something unseen, not souvenirs, not guilt, but an awakening. They had glimpsed the strength of a nation that fought with its ideals, not just its weapons. They had seen freedom disciplined, justice measured, mercy deliberate. And in the quiet of their thoughts, many made a vow that if they ever rebuilt their country, it would not be with fear, but with faith in humanity. By the time they reached the port, they were no longer the same men who had disembarked months or years before. The war had stripped them of their pride. America had given them back their souls. They had arrived as soldiers of an empire. They were returning as students of democracy. And though the fences would vanish behind them, the lessons would remain, etched forever into the conscience of those who had once believed that strength and mercy could not exist together. They now knew better. The true victory was not on the battlefield. It had happened quietly, behind the barbed wire of an American camp, in the minds of men who had learned that humanity, not hatred, was the last fortress worth defending. The ships cut through the gray Atlantic like slow-moving ghosts, their decks crowded with men staring eastward toward a homeland they barely remembered. The sea was calm, but inside every heart there was a quiet storm. Each man stood against the rail, not as a soldier returning in glory, but as a witness returning from exile, not only from America, but from the illusions of his own past. The horizon stayed empty for days. The wind carried the smell of salt and oil, and sometimes faintly of coal from the engine stacks. The voyage home was long enough for reflection, long enough to confront what waited on the other side. Some kept journals, others carved small shapes from wood to pass the hours. Most simply watched the water, each wave folding into the next like memories they could not erase. When at last the outline of Europe appeared, a blur of coastline rising from the mist, no one cheered. The sight was familiar, yet foreign. Their homeland was no longer the land they had left behind. It had been scorched, divided, humiliated. Cities that once pulsed with life now lay broken. Church towers were split, bridges drowned in rivers of rubble. The empire they had been told would last 1,000 years had not even survived their youth. When the ships docked, they disembarked in silence. The air smelled of dust, of smoke, of endings. Their uniforms were gone. Their rank meant nothing now. They were processed quickly, names taken, papers stamped, questions asked. Then, one by one, they stepped into a world that felt smaller, dimmer, older. Germany was not a nation then. It was a wound. Everywhere they went, they saw faces hollowed by hunger, children in rags, buildings stripped to their bones. The streets echoed with a new kind of quiet, not the silence of order, but the exhaustion of survival. There was no music in the cafes, no laughter from the corners, only rebuilding, brick by brick, breath by breath. And yet, amidst the ruin, there was something stirring, a fragile determination. The people, though broken, had begun to look not to flags or Führers, but to each other. They had seen what blind obedience had brought, and now they searched for meaning in humility, not in grandeur. For the returning prisoners, this awakening felt strangely familiar. They had lived its early form inside the fences of America. Now they saw it unfolding across their homeland, the slow rebirth of a conscience. Many of them tried to find their families. Some succeeded. Some learned that their homes had vanished, their loved ones lost to the war. In the ruins, they wept without shame. But even in grief, there was a strange sense of peace, a recognition that they were not alone in their loss. Everyone had lost something. Those who found work took whatever they could, clearing rubble, repairing roads, planting in the fields. Their hands, once trained for war, now learned creation. Each act of rebuilding was a quiet act of redemption. At night, they told stories, not of battles, but of the camps in America, of the food, the fairness, the small acts of respect that had reshaped them. Some neighbors listened with disbelief, others with longing. They spoke of guards who treated them as men, of towns where democracy was lived, not preached. They spoke of a freedom that did not destroy, but healed. In those conversations, something began to take root. A new idea of what Germany could become. Years passed. The rubble thinned. Walls rose again, streets reopened, schools returned. The men who had once been prisoners became fathers, teachers, craftsmen, citizens. They carried inside them the invisible seed of another nation, one built not on fear, but on responsibility. Some of them never spoke of America again. Others could not stop. They kept the memories alive, passing them quietly to their children. Lessons learned behind barbed wire, lessons about dignity and restraint, about how even in captivity, humanity could survive. When West Germany began to rise, built on democracy and accountability, many of those former POWs recognized the principles. They had seen them before, in motion, across the ocean. And though few admitted it aloud, they knew that the America they once fought had helped shape the Germany they now hoped to build. Sometimes, late at night, they would recall moments that still glowed in memory. The warmth of a campfire in a Kansas winter, the laughter of guards playing cards, the sound of church bells drifting beyond the fences. Ordinary sounds, but to them, they were reminders that decency could survive even war. They began to understand that freedom was not a gift, nor a right. It was a practice, a discipline that demanded honesty, courage, and mercy. Decades later, when peace felt secure and the ruins had long been replaced by cities of glass and steel, some of the surviving men returned to America, not as captives, but as guests. They walked through the fields where their camps once stood. The fences were gone, the watchtowers silent. In their place were open meadows, children playing, wind moving through the grass. One man bent down and pressed his hand into the soil. He said nothing, but in his eyes was a quiet gratitude for the nation that had fought him without hatred, that had captured him without cruelty, and that had freed him without demand. He looked up at the sky, bright and endless, and understood at last that victory was never about who conquers. It was about who remembers with compassion. And as the years faded and the world moved on, their story remained one of the war's strangest truths, that in captivity they had found freedom. In defeat they had discovered dignity, and in the heart of their enemy they had glimpsed the soul of humanity itself. For history is not written only by those who win wars, but by those who learn from them. And so, across the decades, their memory endures, not as soldiers or victims, but as men who crossed an ocean as enemies and returned home as believers in something larger than victory. They had left their youth in the ruins of an empire and found their manhood in the mercy of a democracy. And though time would bury their names, the truth they carried would remain, whispered through generations like a vow, that the greatest power a nation can wield is the power to remain human.